Aloha mai kako e komo mai. Hello and welcome to our audience members and to those who are here on the webinar. Also, I have to give a very special thank you to Maui College Chancellor Dr. Louis Hoko Ana and our college staff who is making this all possible. This is very, very much appreciated. This talk is co-sponsored by Maui College and the Maui Branch of the American Association of University Women. My name is Pat Gottschalk and I'm the president of the AAUW Maui Branch. This week is the 50th anniversary of signing very important Title IX legislation 50 years ago, which is sort of amazing when you think about it, which provides for equality for federally funded program for women and girls. Very extremely important legislation. So AAUW Maui wanted to celebrate this extremely important time and didn't know quite what we were going to do, but then a series of wonderful coincidences happened that a new book, a brand new biography was published of Patsy Mink, our local hero, and that one of the authors was going to be on Maui. And so it was just, you know, an amazing kind of set of circumstances. So we're so grateful. Although Hawaii is very far from the continental US in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, our INA has had a tremendous impact upon women's rights legislation due to our local hero, Maui-born and raised Patsy Mink. Just today, a resolution was introduced in Maui County Council. I have a copy of it here somewhere. Anyway, there was a resolution introduced at the Maui County Council honoring Patsy Mink. So Maui is definitely trying to make, you know, everyone aware of her, everything she's done for women's rights. When Title IX was passed, not many women realized the dramatic impact it would have on women and girls sports programs. So there is an excellent documentary about that called The Rise of the Wahine. But Title IX goes beyond sports. It was really intended to provide equality for educational programs. Now, I always thought of Patsy Mink primarily in the context of Title IX, but having read the book, I have learned that she was much more than that, and I'm sure the authors will be giving you much more information about that. So let me first introduce, we're so lucky to have Professor Wu here. Judy Wu is Professor of Asian American Studies and Director of the Humanities Center at the University of California, Irvine. And Gwendolyn Mink, who cannot be here, but hopefully we will get a recorded message because of the internet connection problem, is retired, and she was the Professor of Politics at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and Professor of Women and Gender Studies at Smith College. And she is also the daughter of Patsy Mink. We ask, if you're online, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and they'll be read to the presenters. Those of you here, if you have questions, if you could hold your questions till the end of the discussion, that would be helpful. So now let me turn this over to Professor Wu.
Thank you so much for being here on a Tuesday morning. I've really been enjoying vacationing on Maui, and the timing worked out. I really want to thank Pat, Jane Yabashiro. I don't know if she's in the room yet. Oh, Jane, very nice to meet you in person. I look forward to talking afterwards. Deanna and the other folks who are helping us with the webcast and the cameras today. And I especially want to acknowledge Ruth Mackay, who is Patsy Mink's cousin. She's in the audience today. And also Ruth's daughter, Claire. Thank you both for coming today. I've read about you and I've heard about you, so it's so wonderful to meet you in person. I'm going to turn this over to Wendy. She is with us, but the internet is a little bit spotty right now, and she's going to begin with a reading from the book. We collaborated together, and we can talk more about that relationship, but each chapter begins with a beautiful memory that she has about her mother. And this is the first memory that's in the book. Wendy, should we go ahead with recording?
I think it's safer to go with the recording.
Okay, but she is there.
The first inter-island trip I remember was a 40-minute flight from Honolulu to Kahului in June 1955 when I was 3 years old to attend my great-grandfather Gojiro Tateyama's funeral. Despite the weight of the moment, Mom dressed me in my prettiest dress, a pale pink dotted Swiss thing with lots of crinoline underneath. I flew to Maui in the early morning with my grandparents, Mitama and Suematsu Takemoto. My parents would come later that same day for what was going to be a long weekend of grieving, remembering, and feasting. The family gathered at Gojiro and Tsuru's home in Kailua, a blip on the map far from population centers, reachable only by driving a narrow, winding road, now known as the Hana Highway, for what could seem like hours. Although they raised 11 children there, Tsuru and Gojiro's Kailua home was a small house with very few amenities. To bathe, one went out to a shed that housed a furo, which was heated by a fire. There was one toilet in the house, another in and out house. The kitchen had running water supplied by a well, with pipes leading to a sink spigot that was covered by a drum tobacco bag to filter out debris. With only sketchy electricity, Tsuru baked her iconic bread using a kerosene stove. Tsuru and Gojiro moved to their Kailua home in 1915, a year and a half after the birth of their youngest daughter, but before the births of their youngest sons. Prior to 1915, the growing Tateyama family lived in a tent and a shack along Waikamoi Stream, a place even more remote than Kailua. On a northeastern slope of Haleakala, Waikamoi Stream flowed through a rainforest far from any town or village and about 3 miles from the nearest road. Life in Waikamoi was primitive and difficult. Gojiro midwifed all of Tsuru's births, as doctors and clinics were inaccessible. The older girls tended to the younger siblings as Gojiro and Tsuru cultivated, prepared, and preserved their very local food. Once a month, Gojiro would hike to the nearest village for supplies. In Kailua, Gojiro and Tsuru raised their family in somewhat improved circumstances, developing good relations with the haole manager at East Maui Irrigation, where Gojiro worked as a ditchman. Less remote than Waikamoi, Kailua was nevertheless isolated, both from agglomerations of people in towns and from Japanese immigrant communities on the plantation. Gojiro held many jobs: ditchman, mailman, owner of a small country store, but his vocation was farming and gardening. He and Tsuru raised chickens and a few pigs for eggs and meat while cultivating the land around them with patches of pineapple and sweet potato, groves of gardenia and ginger, and thickets of tea leaves. Much of this bounty fed the family, but Gojiro also sold some of it. The family's dependence on the land fostered great respect for nature, the environment, and sustainability. This love of the soil, water, and forests of Maui was quite possibly Gojiro and Tsuru's greatest legacy to my mother. Mom's parents nurtured this love of the land and respect for its bounty in their own home life. As young children, Mom and her brother Eugene helped raise chickens and grow fruits and vegetables. Their Hamakuapoko home was much closer to towns and communities than was their grandparents' Kailua home, but it was still country living. Mom's Tateyama childhood permeated my own childhood home life, though I didn't know that before I visited Kailua. Going to Kailua showed me that many practices in the Takemoto Mink household were not unique, but rather interpretations of folkways learned from Tsuru and Gojiro. Now I understood that Mom's love of koge rice was not about salvaging a culinary mistake. It was about savoring family memories evoked by that crispy crunch. Now I saw why my mother glowed with joy when she puttered in the garden watching bananas grow. The Tateyama family revered two things: the patriarch Gojiro and the land. Gojiro's funeral was my father's baptism into the extended family. In Hawaii for less than 3 years when Gojiro died, my father was new to our extended family rituals and culture. To some in the family, my father no doubt was a strange white man, an interloping mainland haole who was clumsy with chopsticks and who had no parental family of his own nearby. But over time, the family embraced him as one of their own. The family's relationship with the land lubricated his passage into its midst, as the land provided common ground for conversation, mutual learning, and respect. My father, a geologist and groundwater specialist, frequented Hawaii's mountain forests as part of his work. Waikamoy Stream, the Tateyama family's point of origin, became familiar terrain to him, as were the challenges of water delivery and coexistence with wildlife. In this, my father shared interests with family menfolk who had worked as ditchmen, or who had mapped plantation irrigation routes, or who knew the forests inside out and could teach him how to behave in the presence of wild boar. Thank you.
Yes, please let's give her a round of applause. Thank you so much, Wendy. I just find the story so beautiful. I'm going to go ahead and start, I think, my PowerPoint. What I'd like to do is to give you an overview of some of the main arguments that we have in the book and provide some examples of what we're arguing about Patsy Mink. We can go to the first slide. Thank you so much. I'm going to see. Yes, there you go. I think this is going to be very familiar with all of you, but maybe for some it might be new information. But I want to just first talk about who is Patsy Mink. She's the first Japanese-American female lawyer in Hawaii, and I imagine that's true for the continent as well. Is that better? Can you hear me better? Okay. That was not her first career choice. She wanted to be a doctor, but she was applying to medical schools right after World War II, and the returning GIs were receiving benefits from the federal government. They were also seen as sort of the rightful owners of those educational opportunities. And so even though she worked very hard in her college to get into medical school, she didn't get into any of them. At the time, women averaged about 4 to 5% of medical schools, and especially after World War II, the competition was very fierce. And so someone said, well, why don't you think about lawyering, because you're a good public speaker, you have opinions. She applied to University of Chicago fairly late, and as with many of the schools that she went to on the continental United States, they thought of her as an international student, even though she was born in Hawaii, third generation, grew up in the US territory. And University of Chicago let her in. They said they didn't meet their international student quota yet. So that's how she got in. But even when she came back to Hawaii to apply for her bar license, there was a common practice that women would lose their legal identities when they married men. And so when she got married to John Mink and came back to Hawaii, the powers that be didn't want to allow her to take the test, saying that she had lost her residency when she married. But because she never lived in the state where John Mink is from, Pennsylvania, she still retained her residency in Hawaii, and she had to, again, fight for that right to become a lawyer here. As many of you know, she was the first woman of color to be in Congress, and I think many people associate Shirley Chisholm with that title. So I think that says something about the way we think about race in the United States, that's much more along black and white lines. But also, I think given that Shirley Chisholm is from New York, the East Coast, there's a way in which I think Hawaii and the Pacific often gets left out of the American imaginary. She's a co-sponsor and defender of Title IX, and there's going to be a fantastic new documentary that's going to be coming out. There's a story in the New York Times today. Naomi Osaka is starting a production company. LeBron James is helping her efforts, and her first project is a short documentary about Patsy Mink. It's going to feature my co-author, Wendy Mink, and it's being produced by Ben Proudfoot, who won the Academy Award for Queen of Basketball this year. It is such a beautiful documentary, so look out for that. I think it's going to be coming out in the next couple of days. And we're happy to answer questions about Title IX, but I think what's something that's really interesting is that when it was initially passed, there wasn't as much concern about the implications of Title IX. But after it was passed is when all the male educational leaders, the athletic lobbies got involved because they realized the implication of Title IX. And as Pat was saying, the implications go beyond sports, right? It's all aspects of education. It's about admissions, it's about scholarship, housing, employment, all the various ways that gender equity could be experienced, right, in educational institutions. And she also ran for the US presidency in 1972. I love this fact about her. She was drafted by the anti-war movement because she was against the war in Vietnam. And she wanted a platform to talk about why she was opposed. And some voters in Oregon said, we want you to run for the presidency. It wasn't as successful as Patsy hoped, but I love that courageousness and that belief that you can run, right? This is your right, and that this is an opportunity to talk about values that are so important. I guess my PowerPoint's a little bit delayed. I don't think this is quite working. Yeah, if you can go to that, that would be great. So I want to talk about why I became so interested in writing about Patsy Mink, and I think it has to do with the way we think about Asian American women, both in academics, but also in the popular culture. That is advancing, great, thank you. I think the predominant image of Asian Americans tend to be that of being a model minority, and that representation emerges at various points in history, but one of the points is the mid-60s as the civil rights movement gains national and international attention. And Asian Americans are often pitted against African Americans, saying this is a group that can succeed by working hard, by not complaining, by not advocating for social change, that they can just do so through educational achievements or economic achievements. And Patsy Mink is someone who really challenges that representation. She stood up, she advocated for changes in policy, she advocated for resources so that we can achieve greater equity. There's also the representation of Asian American women, especially, as being Oriental dolls, as being exotic, as erotic, as pleasers, especially of white men. And this is something that Patsy Mink herself faced. There were various stories that covered her as if she was a beauty contestant as opposed to a politician. I remember one story in particular. She went to a national political convention, and the reporter kept on asking her about her measurements and how attractive she is, as opposed to asking her what did she believe in, what was her political platform. There's also a way in which Patsy Mink really challenges the way we think about feminism. Oftentimes it's described as waves. So the first wave is associated with the political activism that leads to the attainment of suffrage, the 19th Amendment. The second wave is associated with the 50s and 60s with women's rights, women's liberation. And then the third wave is something that we often mark as the 1990s, in which there's much more of a focus on intersectionality, or the ways in which different identities build upon one another. So it could be race, it could be class, it could be ability, sexuality, along with gender. Now, these caricatures or these descriptions of these different waves don't quite make sense of someone like Patsy Mink. She was in Congress, right? She was at the political stage. She was part of the political stage, and so she was part of mainstream politics, whereas a lot of the movements that were described in the 60s, 70s really focus on grassroots activism. She was someone who might be described as a liberal feminist because she was trying to gain equality, equal rights. But she had really radical ideas about how to gain equal rights. And so looking at Patsy Mink, I think, gives us different insights about the complexity of feminism and the ways in which someone like her challenges the way we think about this history. And here I just want to share a quote by Sheila Sandoval, who is a Latinx thinker, theorist. And here she says, women of color feminist methodology operates through a differential consciousness that refuses any singular intersecting oppression. So instead of thinking and describing people along, in some ways, somewhat rigid political lines, this person's a liberal feminist, this person's a radical feminist, this person's a women of color feminist, she talks about how women of color, because they've expressed multiple forms of oppression, that they utilize different political pathways, they utilize political strategies. And that's very much needed given the type of experiences they have. So I'm going to give you some examples of the ways in which Patsy Mink, I think, gives us new insights about feminism. So the first insight I want to share is this idea of bridge feminism. And I'm using this term that other people have described as well, used as well. And to really think about Patsy Mink not as someone who's in Washington, D.C., separated from grassroots activists, but actually being conversation, being collaboration with social movements. An example I want to share with you, is that coming through? Is about her involvement in the US war in Vietnam. And I am going to show a term that might be triggering for some people, but I did want to emphasize how she had a very racialized understanding of the war. So one of the facts about Vietnam, which I find so shocking, even though I know it, is that if you take all the bombs that were dropped during World War II, which is a global war, and you triple that, that's how much was dropped on Vietnam, which is a relatively small country. 2/3 of those bombs, so twice as many bombs as World War II, was actually dropped on South Vietnam, which is the US ally. There's a famous quote by a US military leader at the time who talked about we had to destroy it in order to save it. We had to destroy this village in order to save the village from communism. So this level of violence that was directed towards a relatively small country was part of the critiques of the ways in which the war fostered a genocidal mentality towards people who were Vietnamese, even the friends of the United States. And Mink talked about this idea by referencing this concept, the mere gook rule. This came up in the aftermath of the My Lai massacre, in which a village of approximately 500 people were killed. There were false or incorrect rumors that there were a stronghold for the Viet Cong. That actually was not the case. US military entered that village and killed people ranging from 2 years old to the 90s. My previous book was about the Vietnam War, and I had a chance to visit that village, and there's plaques where families lived, and you got to see the intergenerational impact of that violence. But very little was done about the people who committed that violence. And Mink talked about this idea that the mere gook rule says that life is less important, less valuable to an Oriental. And that was something that was expressed by military leaders at the time. Laws that protect other human beings not applied to so-called groups. This racial critique of the war, and there's other ways in which you can critique the war along the lines of race, the disproportionate numbers of Black and brown soldiers. She connects that with other racialized wars like World War II. So during the first annual meeting of the Association for Asian American Studies, Mink talks about the ways in which World War II justified the incarceration of Japanese Americans. War against Japan justified mass detention based on the belief that the inscrutable Oriental could not be trusted. The entire population of one national origin overnight became the enemy, stripped of property, rights, and citizenship, human dignity, and due process of law. This is something that not only Mink was making this type of argument at the time, but social movement activists at the time were also making those connections. So some of the publications, movement publications, would have Tule Lake, one of the incarceration camps, Hiroshima, Vietnam, right? Linking those 3 different sites. So what did Mink do about this? In addition to speaking in Congress, making these arguments, running for the presidency, she also traveled to Paris in 1972. Sorry. Yeah. If you could just go ahead and advance to the bottom of that page. So here she is in Paris with Bella Abzug, who comes out of an organization called Women Strike for Peace. And Women Strike for Peace was founded, I think, in 1960-61. They were interested in making an intervention in international politics. And they did so by claiming the identity of being housewives and mothers. Like, they wanted to save their families, and therefore they were worried about nuclear escalation, about nuclear war. They wanted to save their sons, and so they wanted to stop the Vietnam War. So Bella Abzug comes out of this organization. She runs for Congress, and she and Patsy were pretty much best friends in Congress. They would sit next to each other, sometimes they would wear similar outfits. And here they are in Paris with Madame Nguyen Thi Binh. She was at the Paris Peace Accord trying to negotiate peace with the United States and with other political powers that were there. She's arguably the most visible Vietnamese woman at the time. She would often host anti-war activists when they traveled around the world, whether it's in Vietnam or in other locations. So I love this image because it shows these three very powerful women who are all in positions of political leadership. Two of them are called congresswomen. The third is I think her title is the vice president or the foreign minister of the political entity that she represented. You can go on to the next one. So that's one example of bridge feminism, the ways in which Patsy Mink is in conversation with social movement activists and foregrounding, amplifying their arguments in various political arenas. The second example I want to give you, or the second instance of feminism I want to share with you, is this idea of intersectional legislative feminism. Oops. If you can go back to the previous slide. Thank you, that's perfect. So here's a quote by Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality. There's a problematic consequence of the tendency to treat race and gender as mutually exclusive categories of experience analysis. This tendency is perpetuated by a single axis framework that is dominant anti-discrimination law, and is also reflected in feminist theory and anti-racist politics. And so she's pointing out that there's a tendency to only think about race, only think about gender, as if they don't connect with each other. And that's why she coins the idea of intersectionality, that it's so important to think about these in combination with each other, to think about various ways in which women might experience discrimination, body type, age, ability, sexuality, race, class, and so on and so forth. Now, oftentimes law is considered a universal practice, right? You have policies that apply to everybody. You think about the universal citizen. And what I find so powerful about Patsy Mink is that she's not necessarily thinking about the universal, which often defaults to whiteness and to maleness and to middle-class identity. Instead, she's thinking about the people who tend to be marginalized. So she's thinking about workers, she's thinking about women, she's thinking about mothers. What are the ways in which they face institutional barriers? And can the law be changed so that there's more resources and the recognition that these oppressions can be challenged? And so the example I have here is Mink's involvement with the childcare movement. This lettering is a little small, so I'm gonna read it to you. But by 1967, so Mink is in Congress at the time in her second term, about 4 million working mothers with children under 6 years of age. So 4 million women with young children. At the time, the existing daycare facilities are available for only about 300,000 to 350,000 children. So you just think about the enormous strain that young mothers or mothers of young children have if they need to work or if they want to work. This is something that Patsy herself experienced. If you see on the far right, this is the family portrait. Wendy is the young child in the picture. This is John and Patsy Mink. Both John and Patsy had careers and had aspirations for careers. And so they really had to pull their hair and scratch their heads about thinking about how do they provide quality childcare for their daughter, Wendy. At the time, they tried to experiment with different things. When they went to Washington, D.C., actually, Wendy shared that she would spend her afternoons after school in Congress, just hanging out at her mother's office. And previously to that, she might go to her grandparents' store. So this is something that she herself, Patsy, faced. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why it was so hard for her to get a job even after she graduated from the University of Chicago. She was a newly minted lawyer in the early 50s, but nobody would hire her. She was Asian American, she was a woman, she was a mother of a young child, so she worked at a department store and also at the university libraries. And that's one of the reasons why they decided to come back to Hawaii. But even then, it was very hard. The big firms tended to hire haole lawyers, and then the smaller firms tend to hire Asian American male lawyers. And so that really left her out trying to figure out how to make use of these incredible educational and intellectual tools that she had. And I also want to point out that growing up in Hawaii, she comes from a plantation society, which I think many of you are already familiar with. and the ways in which the plantation society is not just relying on male labor, but also female labor. So the plantation owners and managers want to make sure import immigrant women along with immigrant men so that the men might be less likely to protest, engage in class protests because they had to think about their families. But for the women, they also worked in the fields for less pay. They also worked after they got out of the fields, cooking for their family, doing laundry, and there were many more men compared to women, so some of the women would also do this work for the other single men, right? No maternity leave, no childcare, right? This, you just worked until you gave birth and you went back as soon as possible, and you relied on family members to take care of your children. So this type of political consciousness, I think, is very much in the minds of someone like Patsy Mink, because she's thinking about, again, workers, women, impoverished people, like what are the resources that they need in order to be able to live and support their families. And I just want to share this quote from Patsy talking about why it's so important to pass legislation for programs like this. The value of federal legislation, as others before me have pointed out, is not only that it provides a specific program and specific amounts of money, and that was very important. Whenever she passed the bill, she would always contact people in Hawaii and say, okay, this is available now, like go apply for these funds, right? It all provides an inspiration for action and leadership at other levels of government, thus having an effect far beyond the simple provision of law themselves. And I love sharing this idea, like what is the purpose of law, right? It's giving us a base guideline of what we think is necessary for the operation of a society, right? These are goals that we aspire to, like Title IX, right? It provides a threshold of equity for women and girls in education. If you don't mind just going on to the next slide. This is my last example. So we've talked about bridge feminism, we've talked about intersectional legislative feminism. The last idea I want to introduce is specific feminism. And here I want to emphasize how important it was that Patsy Mink came from Maui, came from the Hawaiian Islands. I think this experience and this worldview was so fundamental in shaping her political values. And the example here I want to share with you, if you don't mind going on, is her opposition to US nuclear testing in the Pacific. Go ahead and just show the other ones and I'll talk through them. So various studies have been done, especially about US nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, previously the Trust Territories. And some scholars have talked about that it's been the equivalent of one Hiroshima-sized bomb every day for 19 years. And this testing was being done out in the open air, and in the open waters. In the 1960s, the United States engages with an international set of agreements. They say they're no longer going to do that because it's so contaminating, has such harmful effects on people and on our planet, that testing then goes underground. And so a series of tests were being proposed in the Bering Straits off of Alaska, especially on this island called Amchitka. And 3 tests were being proposed. The largest one was 1971. That was the Kanakan Test, and that test was a 5 megaton bomb, 400 times the power of Hiroshima. There was a lot of opposition to this type of testing, even though it was done underground, and that in fact the organization Greenpeace was founded in response to these tests. And as you can imagine, people in Hawaii are very concerned. In fact, there's a letter here from the American Federation of Teachers in Hawaii, a telegram, saying that Amchitka test on site edging San Andreas Fault is playing Russian roulette with America. If you see that map on the right, your right, with all those red dots, each one of those dots represents seismic activity. So this is one of the most earthquake-prone areas of the world. And it was chosen for that purpose because scientists want to find out, can you tell the difference between a nuclear bomb going off versus an earthquake? But a nuclear bomb could potentially generate an earthquake, could trigger an earthquake, which in turn could generate tsunamis, right? And that's something that doesn't get isolated in that part of the world, but it really percolates and generates across the Pacific. And this is one of the reasons why people in Hawaii, including Patsy Mink, were so concerned. She was also concerned about environmental pollution. This is what she writes to Richard Nixon in 1971. "We are already polluting our oceans and damaging our fisheries and even the microscopic oxygen-producing sea organisms which sustains all life on this planet. It is acknowledged that the Mchika blast will introduce radioactivity into the ocean. The only question is how soon and how much. The peril of miscalculation is too great to permit such a risk." It was very interesting doing this research. One of the companies that was commissioned to calculate the risk was actually based in Columbus, Ohio, which is where I was living at the time when I was doing this research. And they had reports saying, okay, this is how many fish we think are gonna die, and this is how many seals we think are gonna die, right? They're trying to figure out what is a calculable or acceptable amount of death to be associated with the test. And what's really interesting to me is that Mchika, if you see on the top right, is actually a nature preserve, the entire island, but they received an exception in order to conduct these tests. And Patsy Mink was someone who I think was very concerned about animal life, about water, but I think she was also especially interested in thinking about the impact on indigenous peoples. So this is a protest letter from the Association of American Indian Affairs in 1971. "Radioactive seepage can contaminate the salmon that pass through Alaskan coastal waters on their spawning migration and seriously threaten the health of thousands of Alaskan natives who depend on salmon as such a major source of food." A lot of the nuclear tests and the storage of nuclear waste tend to occur or tend to happen on indigenous lands. And so I think there's a certain mindset that it's acceptable for this type of violence to occur, especially on Native people and Native lands. I did want to also emphasize, this is not something that was so far away, but also not necessarily nuclear testing, but conventional testing and chemical testing that was happening in Hawaii. So I first read about Kahualaui, and it was so amazing to be able to actually see it when I'm on this island, but I think many of you know that was, for a long time, a military site where bombing runs were being conducted on Kahualaui. There were also chemical weapons that were being released in the forests. Mink would find out about this, and Elmer Carvalho, right, they would tell the military, like, you need to stop doing this because it's so dangerous, and it also has an impact on the populated areas because sometimes the pilots get a little confused and they drop bombs on places like Maui. The military said, no, we don't do that thing. We don't do that. And Elmer Carvalho said, there's a bomb in my backyard, right, that has been recently dropped. Or you can see the military say, oh, we don't do this. We just do limited chemical testing, right? So just all that doublespeak that was happening. So Mink was someone who was really trying to speak truth to power. And again, I think it's because of her location here in the Pacific and the ways that she sees the Pacific as being interconnected through the waters, through the islands. I just want to emphasize this map. It's a little bit hard to see, but these are all the islands across the Pacific, and the dates in which they become part of the United States are mid-19th, late 19th century. And it's part of a global strategy of the United States becoming a world power, that in order to become a world power, they need to access Hawaii, they need to access American Samoa, they need to access Guam, they need to access the Philippines. Right? These are all naval way stations along with economic way stations. So it's really part of what Mink is combating in the 60s and 70s during the Cold War is something that started in the late 19th century that's deeply connected to Hawaii's history. I think I'm going to forgo the video. I wanted to just show. You do? Okay, well, maybe I will show it then. So this is, maybe you may already know Kimberly Basford's wonderful documentary about Patsy Mink called The Head of the Majority. And I just wanted to show the introduction, the trailer to that film in case you don't know the film.
What you endure is who you are. And if you just accept and do nothing, then life goes on. But if you see it as a way for change, life doesn't have to be this unfair. It can be better. Maybe not for me, I can't change the past, but I can certainly help somebody else in the future so they don't have to go through what I did.
Patsy Mink grew up among the cane fields of Maui. and made her mark on Capitol Hill as the nation's first woman of color in Congress.
Women's rights are about fundamental justice.
She was one of a kind. I'd never interacted with an Asian woman who was in the power circles, who was creating public policy and moving the women's agenda.
She had no patience for injustice, and she had no patience for intolerance.
Our whole government operates under the notion of secrecy, of not informing the people, of not honestly dealing with the issues.
She ran for President of the United States and wrote laws that overturned decades of discrimination against women in higher education and sports.
You must have, in any movement, people who are insistent and demanding. Somebody has to be your conscience to make you ashamed of yourself.
I've run many, many times, and I've lost many times, but I've never given up. A feeling that I, as an individual, and you, as an individual, can make the difference.
So inspiring. So the last slide, if you could just go through it. So just a reminder, we talked about bridge feminism, intersectional legislative feminism, Pacific feminism. And I did want to end with the quote, "Ahead of the Majority," which is also the name of the film by Kimberly Bassford. So that's a quote when Patsy Mink runs for the US Senate in 1975-76, and she didn't win. Sparky Matsunaga won. But I, again, love that political sense of courage that she has. And this is what she says about the idea, being ahead of the majority. "It is easy enough to vote right and be consistent with the majority, but it is much more often more important to be ahead of the majority. And this means being willing to cut the first furrow in the ground and stand alone for a while if necessary." Thank you. So we're happy to take questions. I'm going to see if Wendy can jump in and answer questions first.
I didn't know if there was a microphone here for if there's, we have two ways of asking questions. We have questions in the audience, but also, Joyce, have there been questions in the chat? Oh, who has the? Oh, okay. Well, why don't we start with the audience? Yeah. If anyone, does this work? Okay, can you hear me? Does anyone have a question? I feel like, what's my line or something here? Anyone have a question from the audience? Let's see, oh, okay, Heather, this is Heather Mueller, who was instrumental in pulling together this event, so thank you, Heather.
So I have two things. Number one, I'd like to say that you all have a cup, or I hope you do. If you don't, see me. And so one of the things that I believe is that there are too many people who are in positions of making a difference who really don't know about Title IX. And I'll tell you that I went to my gym where there are young athlete women, athletic people, and I said, yeah, my AAUW group is doing this thing on Patsy Mink. Blank. And I said, yeah, you know about Title IX, you guys. Blank. Then I thought I'd really throw something in. You know about women suffragettes. So what I'm hoping and what I'm envisioning is that you'll take these cups, and some of the young people in our lives may say, well, who's that? Or what is Title IX? And in other words, maybe we can use it as an opportunity for raising some awareness about Patsy Mink and about the struggles that she went through and the struggles that are not ending. And in fact, it's a very, shall we say, real risk that this Supreme Court might even mess with this law. So that's the one thing I wanted to say. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that there is a boat called the Golden Rule. Did any of you hear about the Golden Rule? The Golden Rule was here in Hawaii for about 1.5 years, a lot of it during COVID. And the Golden Rule in the 50s went to the Marshall Islands and Bimini and to the places where that had been nuclear aggressed. And they got into all kinds of trouble, you know, with the Navy, and people got thrown into the clink and all the rest. And then the boat went back to California. It's a sloop. I think it's a 35-foot sloop called the Golden Rule. You can look it up, but they've got a wonderful website. And their purpose is to raise awareness about the nuclear issues that are continuing in our world today. So the Golden Rule then went back to Humboldt County, to the bay, Humboldt Bay, and sank down into the bottom of the bay. And about 10 years ago, they raised up this sloop, this sailboat, and it came to Hawaii. As I said, it was in Hawaii for about 1.5 years, as far as I know. And now this Golden Rule is making a trip. It hasn't started yet, I don't believe, but it plans to go down the Mississippi River, up the East Coast, into the St. Lawrence Seaway, and all through the Great Lakes. And I think that's a trip that's being scheduled for starting in the spring, I think. But the whole purpose of this boat, called the Golden Rule, is to raise our awareness as to what's still continuing to be threats in the nuclear area of life. Okay.
Let me come to you. We have one question from the chat, so we'll alternate. Question from the chat was to ask you and Gwendolyn, how did you meet up together? How did you decide to write this book together?
Wendy, I'm going to defer to you first.
Well, it was I don't know, it was a dramatic intervention by some friendly spirit that brought Judy and me into proximity. I started attempting to conceive of a biography of my mother around 2008 or so. I didn't get very far in my work on it, in part because I was uncertain how to meld the two sides of my personality and approach as an author, the daughter side and the scholar side. And so I went through quite a lot of belly aching about that. And as I was belly aching, Judy was discovering that there was a wealth of research material at the Library of Congress on my mother, and so came to DC, which is where I am, and we met and decided that we had a basis for a collegial relationship in forging a book together. And starting in 2012, 10 years for Judy, that's what we did.
I remember telling Wendy it's going to take me 10 years because that's what happened to my previous books, and she kind of looked at me like, you know, how old are you? But we made it. So we started the 40th anniversary of Title IX, and we're ending at the 50th anniversary. I'm really grateful for Wendy. I remember just going to talk to her and doing oral histories, and then when I found out that her mother wanted her to write her biography, I felt like we needed to collaborate. I mean, I feel like Wendy has much more of a right to write about her mother than I do. And you got a taste of the vignettes that she shares, and each one is very powerful. And she talks about the Golden Rule, stopping in Hawaii, and Patsy Mink helping to defend the civil rights protesters who were, sailing into waters that are not allowable at that time. So it's been really wonderful to be able to collaborate. And actually, I want to share, Wendy had these bracelets made of our title of the book, so it's Fierce and Fearless, and we also want a feminist, so we have all three.
That's great, thank you.
Aloha, my name is Cynthia Monteleone. I am the current 400-meter world champion for my age group. And I'm also a coach here locally. I coach the girls and boys track team at Lahaina Luna, as well as Olympic athletes. I have the heptathlete national champion. I'll try not to make this too long. I'm here celebrating Title IX today and this week because I am the daughter of a poor Navajo Apache mother who got a college scholarship. And because I got a college scholarship, I was able to then move on and teach others what I learned. So I really am appreciative to Patsy Mink, especially living here on Maui and being able to share this with our youth. I definitely educate my children, my track athletes, about Patsy Mink and her legacy. I do have one concern, and I realize that this is a concern that reaches across political parties, but I myself have had to race a biological male identifying as a female at my world championship meet. My daughter raced her very first track meet here on Maui against a biological male identifying as female, and we all welcome everyone to participate. We are champions of individuality. However, I'm really wondering, my question is to Wendy about her opinion on the current administration's interpretation of Title IX being that they interpret it as gender identity, when in the original Title IX, it just says sex. So that is my question. What is Wendy's opinion on the current interpretation? Mahalo.
Well, I support the current interpretation, and I support the thrust of Title IX, which is inclusion and equality through inclusion. So if there are challenges to figure out how that inclusion takes place, then we should figure that out. But I don't think that any of the transphobic proposals are the way to go. And I don't think that blanket exclusions of individuals based on their gender identity is the way to go. The language of sex discrimination has always been interpreted. I mean, it's gone two ways in public policy. Sometimes sex discrimination is referred to as gender discrimination, and sometimes gender discrimination is referred to as sex discrimination. And it's hard to pin an argument on the terminology that was used in a certain moment in time, given that variability. Even the court has acknowledged that. For example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has acknowledged that she would often talk about gender discrimination because she thought the judges or the elected people were less ruffled if you talked about gender than if you used the word sex, for example. So I don't know. I would not embrace the idea that a rigid, sort of terminological interpretation of Title IX is a basis for creating exclusions of all of our children. The point of Title IX is the inclusion of everyone in opportunity, however that opportunity should be constructed.
Thank you. Before we go to any more questions, I wanted to mention that we do have a reception after this talk out on the patio out there. We have some light refreshments and beverages. So just recognize that you don't have to just get back in your cars. There's going to be plenty of time to chat afterwards. Let me see. Any questions in the chat? I had a question. Now let's hope I can remember it. My having read the book, I felt that Representative Mink was very good at compromise, and I wonder how. Also, she had very strong and firm feelings, but she probably knew how to work her way through the legislative process of compromise. And I just wonder how she would feel, if anyone can speculate, dealing with sort of today's hyper-polarized political world.
Wendy, do you want to begin?
Well, I think that the first thing to say is that while today's political discourse and sort of the political behavior of individuals is offensive and sometimes violent and definitely ugly. It is not unique to this moment. During the 1960s, for example, there were crude and nasty political actors who lambasted their foes in Congress, constantly calling them terrible things and accusing them of being communists and all of that sort of thing. So we're not, social media makes everything worse, but we're not inventing de novo here in the 21st century. As for the issue of compromise, I think that the media makes it seem like one has a choice to either be somebody who does compromise or somebody who takes a strong stand and sticks to it. And those are polar opposites, and nary the twain should meet. I think my mother thought that compromise was something that you needed to know when to do. Sometimes, you know, when you had a large legislative package, you would end up deciding that you would have to compromise on some things in order to get the good parts enacted into law. But presented with something like, you know, a compromise on continuing the war in Vietnam, she would not compromise on that sort of question. You know, it wasn't joining the majority was not was not a positive that that sort of drove her decision making. The right thing was what drove her decision making. Enacting legislation that was going to be useful to people was what joined her decision making. And sometimes that meant holding your nose and going along with a larger policy. Sometimes it meant compromising. Sometimes it meant simply washing your hands and saying, I'm sorry, we need to hold the line here and insist on doing things a different way.
Thank you. We do have a question in the chat that I think, let me do the chat next if I could. Would you be able to comment on the backlash and backsliding today about feminism and women's rights as compared to the women's movement of the 1970s?
Do you want to begin, Wendy? Or do you want me to? You look like you might be frozen. Okay, well, I will do my best. Well, I was going to go back to the question of compromise because actually I think of Mink as taking stances that are really principled, and that there were other people who commented on her being able to kind of stick to her positions when compromise was expected. There were some early interactions between Patsy Mink and Daniel Inouye when they were both in the territorial Senate and House, or I think it was Assembly at the time. And he described her as being kind of willing to take stances that she thinks are principled, but that he was expecting her to play along a little bit more. And so I just thought it was, so interesting the way that he was characterizing her, because in some ways she was being too strong. She was being too, in some ways, masculine, whereas he wanted her to kind of play along and be differential, especially to, I think, party hierarchies. In terms of the 1970s, I agree with what Wendy was saying, that there was backlash then, in 1970s, 1990s, now. The example I gave you about Title IX and the various ways in which all these lobbies were trying to dilute the impact of Title IX. It was passed in 1972 for about a 2-year period. The, Human Education and Welfare Division was in charge of trying to think about how do you actually implement the policy. And so they were deluged with letters and phone calls. People were saying, well, can we just take out the federal funding piece? Like, you know, okay, if you have a violation, there's no implications for Title IX, right? Violations of Title IX. Can we exclude private schools? Can we exclude athletics? Can we have single-sex honorary societies? Can we not apply to physical education? I mean, basically, we're doing anything possible to take out the full impact of Title IX. So every time that there were these advancements, there was backlash, whether it's at the legislative level or at the kind of individual day-to-day level. One of the pieces of legislation that was passed after Title IX is the Women's Educational Equity Act. And Title IX in some ways is about negative rights, right? You cannot prohibit, right? You cannot deny opportunities. Women's Educational Equity Act was about giving resources. So giving money to universities, to schools, so that you can create curriculum, to create women's centers, to fund feminist studies, right? So how do you actually shift the culture, right? You can just say you can't discriminate, but how do you actually change people's minds? How do you develop new textbooks so that young girls and young boys have different understandings of what the possibilities are? And they really had to kind of hide that piece of legislation. And it did not get fully funded. It was authorized for much more money than what it was actually provided. But it was still being attacked decades afterwards under President Bush. The right went after it and said this is, a conspiracy legislation. It's empowering Dolores Huerta of the farm workers and letting them find ways to empower female workers. So I think that backlash has been there, and it's a reflection of how hierarchical our society is and how resistant people are to change.
Thank you. Why don't we make this our last question, and then if there's more questions, we can do it outside with some beverages and snacks.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you. My name is Maureen Dwyer. I've been coming to Maui for 8 years now as a part-time, several-month stay. My home is in Vermont when I'm not here. And I have a little bit of a perspective. I was a nurse in Vietnam in 1970 in the Army in a trauma ICU. And I remember we took care of everybody. We took care of the Vietnamese patients. We took care of the GI trauma patients, our main, of course, commitment. We took care of civilians, mothers, children, the quote enemy, North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong. And I will say there were so few of us nurses there, women at that time, but we all learned to see the soul of each person as unique and no division among humanity. And I feel I'm very impressed with Shirley's, with Patsy's life story, because it seems that throughout my that was a very big moment that colored my whole professional and personal life, is in terms of so many of the GIs had to really dehumanize the quote enemy in using these slurs in order to even do their job. And there's great amount of anguish that many are and still go through. But I will say my feeling is, and I really liked the last quote about standing alone sometimes, is I feel feminine intelligence is needed very much so today across all kinds of leadership in this country. And so many assumptions are made about women of all different ages that are not true. And I feel it starts with getting, even among women, to have more of a sisterhood and not have an us versus them. And whether it's media or politics, and I think Patsy was such a leader of empowering, not letting these older systems, and I don't like to use patriarchal and all that, but define women. I think women need to start really defining themselves. And I feel what I'd like to ask is, going forward, what is the vision that we can take from her amazing story and help empower women across the spectrum and have us be more respectfully not so quiet about the assumptions made.
Thank you. Wendy, are you back? Do you want to comment? Oh, we can't hear you. Oh, Wendy, can you unmute?
Yeah, I keep getting dropped. So if you have a response, you should start, because I'm going to get garbled.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's so many rich things that you shared with us. I don't know if I'm glad that you had that experience with the war, because it's a very traumatic experience to go through to come to that understanding, right? The sense that that we all need to take care of each other. I live in Orange County, which has the largest Vietnamese population outside of Vietnam, and the reason they're there is because of war. And many of the people, I think maybe, almost all of them were on the US side, and that's why they came to the country. But scholars have developed this new idea called critical refugee studies to think about what is the connection between refugee populations, which raises the question of being humanitarian, right? The United States being the welcomer of these refugees. What is the connection between their status as refugees and the war itself, right? Because the United States was such an instigator of that war that led to the conditions of refugee relocation. There's also a really important concept, I think, about, which is that Viet Nguyen, who won the Pulitzer Prize for the book Sympathizer, he has another book called Wars Never Die, I think is the title. And that even though there might be an end on the battlefield, there's an end in terms of diplomatic negotiations. How does it end for people, right, who've lived through that experience? And how do they come to terms with it, emotionally, psychologically? And it's such a difficult experience to go through and to develop a sense of identity and, I think, morality, right, coming out of such horrific wars. I also really appreciate your comment about, like, what's the next step? So one of the speeches that we begin the book with and end the book with is the 30th anniversary of Title IX, and that's the year that Patsy Mink passed away. She was visiting in Hawaii, and she never had chickenpox. And so it's possible that she contracted chickenpox when she was interacting with some school-aged children when she was here. And that's what she eventually died of. But she talks about Title IX as not something just in the past. I think this is a comment that was made earlier. But you have to have this eternal vigilance about it, because it can be taken away. It can be interpreted in a way that loosens its impact. And so I think it's also a broader lesson about being part of a democracy. Right? You need to be vigilant. You need to pay attention. You need to assert your voice and to demand what is right, even when it's not popular, even if you feel like you're alone, because by taking that stance, you invite other people to also speak truth to power with you. So I think that's the lesson that I like sharing about Patsy Mink. Wendy disappeared. Oh no, she's back.
Oh, she's back.
Okay, did you want to say anything?
Well, I missed most of what you've said, so I think we just have to leave me out of it. I'm sorry, the Wi-Fi connection or internet connection just died.
I'll ask you. So the question is, like, what are the lessons that we can draw from Patsy Mink's life and political career? Are there things that you want to reinforce?
Well, what did you say?
Eternal vigilance.
Yeah, that's it. Keep on keeping on, right? I mean, identify your principles, the things that matter to you and to the people around you. Stand up for them, and keep on fighting for them. Keep on defending those principles, and figure out ways to work towards the goals that those principles embrace. I mean, that's how she lived her life, right? I mean, the inner details of whatever the goals are might change over time, over the decades, but the willingness to fight and the knowledge that no victory for a just end is the end of the story, right? The story goes on, and you need to be part of it to make sure it continues in the right direction.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers. And could you put that thank you slide up for me, if you would? Yeah, this has really been just amazing experience. I'm just so pleased that we were able to have this and that you all could experience it. So it's hard to clap with a microphone. And I just have to thank, because this was a joint effort and so many people put so much time into it. I want to particularly thank Deanna here, who has been keeping the technology going for us. Everyone on the list, Lydia Furumoto made the lovely lei. Mahalo nui loa for those. And the food that you can go outside and eat was provided by these people. So if you'd like to join us outside. Also, I want to congratulate both Gwendolyn Mink and Judy Wu on the portrait unveiling that's going to be in Washington, D.C. Thursday. A portrait of Patsy Mink will be hanging in the U.S. Capitol. So, aloha.